This, I think, will be the last video in this series on this set of PowerPoints, and I'm going to kind of buzz through it because as soon as I go through it, it's going to be out of date anyway. We're talking about modern processors for PCs and servers. And really, there are only two big companies that come to mind, and those would be Intel and AMD. Now, Motorola had a good run of it some time ago. In the early days of Apple, Apple used Motorola until the 2000s or so, and then they switched over to the Intel series of CPUs because Intel had more power, basically, than the Motorola ones did. Now, Motorola isn't totally out of the game, by the way. Today they primarily do embedded systems, so embedded computers in cars and things like that. So they still have their own niche that they're serving. Okay, well, let's run through some of these. Some of the modern systems of today, which typically have 2 or more cores and 64-bit architecture. As a matter of fact, if you have Windows 11, you have to have 64-bit. Windows 11 will not run on 32-bit. Most CPUs today, the vast majority, are Intel CPUs, and they run on the 8086 family of CPUs. Now, when I say 8086 family, that's a very, very old term. This is one of the earliest versions of these, and we went on after that to the 8186, 8286, 8386, the 8486, then the Pentium, and so on. Now we've broken it down into several other types. Now we have the Core series, for example, which is probably the most common in home PCs. The Core i5, the Core i7, the Core i9. I believe the Core i9 is the latest version, although it keeps coming up with new iterations. Multiprocessors are multi-core. Now, I believe that the Core i9, the 14th generation, which is the most current one, I think, as of this recording, is capable of 24 cores. This says with as many as 72 or more cores. Most of those are server machines, and there are some processors out there that may be capable of this, but they are not found widely in the market. When we talk about the word microarchitecture, we're talking about the circuitry, the characteristics of that CPU that allow for the instruction set size, the bit size, how many cores it can support, how much memory it can support, and all of that. The most current microarchitecture is called Cascade Lake AP. Now, I haven't looked this up to see if that's still true. This was copyrighted in 2021, so I suspect there is a later version. However, this can support up to 56 cores, so it's not too far out of date. L3 cache up to 77 megabytes. We have a little table here of Intel processors. Here's the Core i9, which was introduced in 2017 and can support 10 to 18 cores. Now today, as I mentioned, we're on the 14th generation of i9s, and so those can support 24 cores. So I know that we're up above this value right now. AMD is the big competitor, if you will, and by the way, I'm using an AMD computer right now. We're going to talk about AMD a little bit more in a few moments, but let me go to my settings app and down to system and then about, and you can see here I'm running the AMD Ryzen Threadripper 2950X. It's a 16 core processor with hyperthreading. It's a virtual 32 core processor, 3.5 gigahertz with 96 gigabytes of RAM installed. So that's the system that I'm running right now. Not too bad a system, and it runs pretty well. The reason I have all that power, by the way, is that I do a lot of virtual machines, and sometimes I run 3 or 4 virtual machines at a time, and I like to be able to give them lots of cores and lots of memory. So that's not a huge amount of memory, by the way. The biggest weakness of this system is my graphics unit, which is not the biggest and best. Those are very, very expensive right now, and I just don't have the money for more right now. But anyway, so the Ryzen 9 is equivalent to the Intel. You can see what they're doing with the names, by the way. The Ryzen 3 similar to the i3, the Ryzen similar to the i7, the Ryzen 5 similar to the i5, and so on. Alright, let's go on down to AMD processors. AMD is a competitor of Intel. Why don't more people go with AMD? You know, I'm really not sure of that. Intel is just better supported, and there are more instructions and more software. Software works better with Intel because that's designed on Intel, for example. They are compatible with software written for the Intel 86 based processors. So this is one reason for the AMD, and this is one of the reasons I use the AMD, and because it's a little bit lower cost for similar performance. It is easier to overclock, although I am not overclocking mine. Overclocking means that internal clock rate that we talked about earlier can be increased. Advanced RISC machines. So you'll see this listed as ARM, ARM, and a lot of times with software you'll see an ARM version of software. That is software that's designed for RISC machines, and RISC machines typically occur in things like mobile devices, your laptop, your phone, tablets, all of that sort of thing tend to use RISC. Notebook computers, all of those tend to use RISC. So if you're downloading software for a mobile device, it's a very good bet that you will want the ARM version of that software. ARM processors are not produced by a specific company. They're produced by many different companies. Alright, we go into the summary after that. I'm not going to do the video on the summary, so I'm going to wrap it up here. And thank you so much for listening. And we'll see you next week in module, I believe it's week 3, but module 4 in our textbook.